We are delighted to have with us Nika Korchok Wakulich to talk to us about how MTV destroyed the music industry. Sorry, I'm not joking. To talk about MTV Reboot, my super sweet 16 malware byte MS-DOS edition.
All right. What's that? Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. This is my super sweet 16-bit malware MS-DOS edition TSR remix. So quick, who am I? My name is Nika. I'm a security consultant at Leviathan Security Group, and I'm also a reverse engineer and artist, and I like malware and hardware hacking and languages and all the other things on there. And greets and big thank yous to everyone who's on that list. It's a lot of people. Wouldn't be here without all of them, so shout out to all of them. Thank you to the team at Leviathan especially, and to BSides for having me. So, all right, so quick disclaimer. The views expressed in this presentation are my own and do not reflect the opinions of my past, present, or future employers. Viewer discretion is advised. So, what this talk is about, in case the very long title did not tip you off, this talk is an introduction to MS-DOS era malware, including an overview of the MS-DOS architecture and the unique threat landscape of the time. It's a starting point for learning about viruses and the techniques that were used in sophisticated malware of the 80s and 90s, but it is not a complete and thorough examination of every piece of DOS-era malware, and it's not an in-depth analysis of malware that targeted other OSs of the era. So Alt-Cloner isn't relevant here, though its RAM infection techniques are, to my heart, very dear. If anyone here gets that reference, you win all the points, and if you don't, I can explain it at the end. And on this slide to the right, we have Marsland by Spanska. So shout out to Spanska, who is one of my favorite virus writers of this era, probably of all time, and whose viruses were actually the reason I was inspired to start this project. I have a background in both computer science and fine arts, and these viruses, frankly, appeal to both sides of that, and I think they're poetry. I love them. Everyone should know about Spanska. So. Go to the next one. There we go. Okay. So a quick overview of how the presentation is going to be structured. We have our introduction, which we already covered, so we're doing great. And we're going to go over motivations, which was essentially my reasons for starting this project and why you would want to study MS-DOS era malware. Definitions, we're going to go over architecture, notable interrupts. Of course, we're going to talk about TSRs. We're going to talk about stealth and persistence techniques and looking at some notable malware samples and connections to modern malware. So motivations. I describe this as choose your own adventure because I had a lot of motivations throughout the course of this project, but the one that I started with was actually C, which was looking at some of these samples. My reaction was, it looks pretty. Why does it look pretty? Why is it also infecting the MBR? Is this malware or is this art? Is it both? I don't have any answers to those questions, but along the way, or definitive answers to those questions, I should say. But along the way, I've leveled up my skills in all of the side quest disciplines that I've listed here. So reversing 16-bit malware has advanced my skills in things like hardware hacking, BIOS reverse engineering, graphics programming, different aspects of VX development, so polymorphism, OS development, and then binary golf for anyone who's a big fan of writing assembly programs like I am. So, all right. So in order to contextualize this, I want to just provide some definitions up front. So a virus. Fred Cohen is actually credited as being the creator of the term virus in his 1984 paper. The full quote is presented there, but we're going to extrapolate on that and define a virus as a self-replicating program that uses a host program to produce new copies of itself. And then a few more definitions. Polymorphic virus is a virus that uses a variable encryption and decryption routine and a variable key to create an encrypted copy of itself in memory that is then appended to or inserted into a host file. The encrypted image of the virus it changes upon each iteration, so it minimizes the presence of known byte patterns for AV signatures and increases the stealth of the virus. And then bootkits. So a bootkit contrasted with a rootkit. A bootkit is a type of malware that infects a critical component of the OS boot process to install itself and maintain persistence. A bootkit presents a more OS agnostic vector for attacking some of the lowest level abstractions available to and used by a computer. So again, contrasted with a rootkit, which is typically more targeted towards a specific OS and oftentimes a very specific version of that OS. A bootkit has a lot more flexibility in the lower level abstraction layers that it can attack, and it has this great ability to maintain further persistence because of that. And then boot sector infector, or BSI. A boot sector infector is the earliest form of a bootkit. So a BSI is a bootkit that targets storage media that didn't have an MBR, and an MBR is a master boot record, which has a partition table and allows you to boot multiple OSs. But a boot sector or a boot sector infector targets storage media that only had a boot sector. So hence the name. And BSIs, especially of this era, targeted various forms of floppy diskettes, again, which didn't use an MBR. All right, so we're gonna have a whirlwind tour of MS-DOS. So the DOS kernel. MS-DOS version 1 debuted in 1981. Version 6.22 debuted in 1984. And some notable features of MS-DOS include it operates in 16-bit real mode. It provides device-independent device access to computer resources using the key programming interface of MS-DOS, which were system functions. I know that's a bit wordy. We'll break some of that down in a few slides. And very importantly, MS-DOS was a single-task operating system, which meant that only one program could run at a time. A TSR is a partial workaround to the limitations of a single-task OS, but even with a TSR, it's still important to remember that it's a single-task operating system. So, and I'll define TSRs in a minute. And just a few more notes on the DOS kernel. MS-DOS's operating system is divided into roughly 3 layers. We have the BIOS, basic input output system, around that, the DOS kernel, and then further encapsulating the command processor, or the shell, which is command.com. So the DOS kernel provides system functions that allow a user to perform actions with a provided collection of hardware-independent services. So these functions let you do things like memory management, spawning programs, character device I/O, all the fun things. Programs in MS-DOS interact with these system functions by loading registers with function-specific values and then transferring control using software interrupts. So using software interrupts with these system functions was the main method that you could do cool things on MS-DOS. So that's what we're going to talk about now. So on here, this isn't even all of the interrupts that would have been used by MS-DOS malware, but I've highlighted a few of the very key ones, especially that are relevant to the samples we're going to be talking about later. There are 2 groups of interrupts. So we have the system interrupts, which are the ROM BIOS interrupts, and then the MS-DOS interrupts. Again, it's not exhaustive, this list, but I've highlighted a notable interrupt in each of those categories. So of the raw and BIOS interrupts. Interrupt 13 handled disk services, so that was a really common target for bootkits. And then int 21, that was the bread and butter of MS-DOS. So if you're analyzing MS-DOS malware, you're going to be seeing int 21 everywhere. And then just in terms of further resources for learning about interrupts on MS-DOS and in relation to MS-DOS malware, you can do a few things, like you can get a book or several, like I did, and just page through all of the resources. But an alternate and really excellent resource, I refer to it here by the really terribly long acronym RTFMS-DOS-S, which is read the effing MS-DOS source, because it's really beautifully, it's often very beautifully and succinctly documented by the virus authors themselves. So this picture here, or this screenshot rather, is from Verdem by Ralph Berger. So thanks a million, Ralph. It's a beautiful ASM file. Okay, so in terms of understanding how we would invoke system calls on MS-DOS, we're going to be talking about the interrupt vector table. So the interrupt vector table was the precursor to the interrupt descriptor table, and it defined the addresses of all of the 256 interrupts in 8086 real mode. So how does one invoke a system call on MS-DOS? Under normal conditions, a software interrupt is triggered with a system call. User makes a system call, for example, int 21, and the system call retrieves the address of the interrupt service routine from the corresponding entry in the interrupt vector table. The address there is stored in one of those, again, 256 entries, and the address is made up of the segment and offset pair, and so once that's retrieved, there's a jump to that retrieved address of the interrupt service routine. System executes the interrupt service routine. Control is returned to the calling program. So there's another diagram that maybe illustrates it in terms of the control flow. All right, so now we're going to be talking about TSRs, or terminate and stay resident programs. Okay. So a TSR is a feature of MS-DOS that allows a user to bypass the limitations of a single task OS by installing a persistent program in RAM, which is then invoked by subsequent interrupts. There's a lot of text there, so I will spare you all of that, and we have a nice diagram right here. So I'm gonna just go through the process of installing a TSR in the most straightforward process. So it starts by retrieving the address of a desired interrupt that you want to hook. So you find the address of that interrupt from the interrupt vector table. You retrieve both of the address components of the target interrupt, and those address components are the segment and the offset, again, because DOS used a segmented addressing scheme. And then the interrupt's address components are saved to a specific address or a specific region of memory. So it can be two variables in the data segment or some other location of memory that's defined by the virus writer. A new interrupt handler is installed in the IVT, interrupt vector table. And then the new interrupt handler has added a new interrupt service routine, which concludes by jumping back to the original address and passing control back. So essentially this whole thing is creating the illusion that the original interrupt has proceeded as per usual and nothing's wrong and nothing's happening on the system. But in reality, there's a system call that's been hooked and something is happening. So, okay, so on this, let's see if this will, there we go, okay. So this is a demo TSR I wrote. It hooks interrupt 21, and it only triggers when a call is made to the exec program, like when a user is launching a program from command.com. The subfunction for int21 there is 4b, so it's checking if 4b is the subfunction that's being called. If a call to int21 is made with any other subfunction, the TSR just redirects back to the saved interrupt21 ISR. But otherwise, a user is greeted with a screen in 256 VGA graphics mode, a modified color palette, and it results in a terminal aesthetic that vaguely is reminiscent of a Commodore 64. So this demo, TSR doesn't do anything nefarious. It doesn't have file infection routines, not really anything too fun other than the fun color scheme. But it's a nice template for understanding how to modify control flow of critical system calls and how to use the TSR as a means of more persistent storage of a payload. Okay, so we're going to be talking now about the whirlwind tour of MS-DOS COM programs. So there were different types of executable files in MS-DOS, COM, EXE, BAT, etc. But COM programs specifically are very interesting for MS-DOS malware because they had a very unique file structure and unique features that presented a nice vector for virus raiders. So COM programs fit the tiny memory model of the Intel 8086 ISA. They always have an origin of 100, which is the 100 in hex, so it's 256 bytes. Which is the length of the program segment prefix, or PSP, which is a data structure that is at the beginning of every COM program. I'm not going to get into that data structure here, but just know that it exists. And then all the segment registers in a COM program contain the same value. So code and data are mixed together. There's no header, there's no reloc information, there's no identifying information really. It's essentially no parents, no rules. Well, okay, not quite. So a few important rules for COM programs is that there was a maximum size, which is roughly 63 kilobytes, including like the length of the PSR, or the PSP, sorry. And COM programs resided in memory as an absolute memory image. And by resides, here we mean is loaded into, and a single segment of memory is 64 kilobytes. And again, importantly, because it's MS-DOS, they're using, COM programs are using a segmented addressing scheme of the 16-bit architecture. So we have 16-bit real mode, but we're accessing addresses in a range of a 20-bit address space, which is done using the segment offset pair. Okay, so all right, so now we have all of our groundwork covered to understand some of the details of very cool malware of this era. So I've called this greatest hits of MS-DOS malware, or not just a pretty payload. And the reason for that is one of the inspirations for at least this part of the talk came from something that someone said to me rather offhandedly when I was describing this project. I explained that I was reversing MS-DOS malware, and they said, oh, the 80s, you mean when malware was just about drawing pretty pictures? So here's a demo of one of those. So this idea isn't wrong entirely. It's not entirely wrong. There's a kernel of truth to it. There were a lot of viruses of this era that focused heavily on graphical tricks, and also that took great pride in their graphical mastery. And using a virus to draw a pretty picture was not uncommon. But I think this sample walker, it encapsulates that pretty nicely because it's absurd, it's funny, it's maybe annoying to a user, but it's relatively benign and not terribly destructive. So because of this, this conception, a lot of people consider these viruses not very sophisticated, not very advanced, which is frankly a mistake. There we go. So in terms of MS-DOS malware techniques in the MITRE ATT&CK framework, we have all of these. This is, again, a non-extensive list, but wow, it's so boring you wouldn't even know it. I will just point out that masquerading was one that I focused on in particular, and I thought was very interesting, especially in the way that graphical components were used and leveraged as a sort of stealth technique. But I've created a different matrix for describing several of the most common and most interesting MS-DOS malware techniques. So we have first classic malware stealth and persistence, and then also exquisite graphical rendering and data manipulation using system functions. And finally, level 10 savage destruction of the MBR and or the boot sector. And in terms of the sources that I used for the virus samples I'm going to be talking about, these are a few of them. So primarily I used the VX Underground GitHub, their MS-DOS malware collection. I think almost all of the samples in that collection are just the source files, so the assembly files. And I'll get to that in a minute, what the process was for working with those. Another source was the Internet Archive's Malware Museum, which was created by Mikko Hipponen. And an important thing to note here is that all of the samples there are defanged binaries, which is helpful for looking at some of the graphical components especially, but they're not as useful for looking at the malicious functionality, especially from an RE or a malware analysis perspective. So if you're interested in that and you want to look into those, it's good to augment those with the full virus. And then in addition, I also used the Zine archives on VX Underground, mostly the 40 hex and the 29A Zine archives, and then also a myriad of knowledgeable experts who wish to remain anonymous. So thank you to all of those sources. Okay, so this is my 16-bit malware RE methodology. It's presented as a list, but it of course did not go in terms of a linear process, but I'm just gonna break down some of these steps a little bit. I started with preliminary research, which meant a lot of reading, a lot of books, a lot of combing through zines. And then when looking at the actual samples, there was, of course, static and dynamic analysis. So for static analysis, I was mostly using RA2. I wrote in an R2 plugin for this for automatically identifying the interrupts in a sample and then adding annotations to the disassembly. In addition, I used Cutter, which was great for when I was too tired to use R2. And then IDA-free version 5.0, which I found through a retro gaming forum, has really good 16-bit support. So RIP to that version, but it's out there. And then in terms of static analysis, as I mentioned previously, I was reading a lot of the source files, which were all just 8086 assembly. The syntax was specific to a very wide range of assemblers, so we have a few of them here. MASM, TASM, FASM, 86, the list goes on. And assembling the source for any of these viruses meant that I had to find the sometimes arcane and not used anymore assemblers for them, which was a fun process, or making modifications directly and patching the assembly, which is a bit more involved, a bit more tedious. And then in terms of dynamic analysis, I used QEMU and FreeDOS a lot, as well as Box, and then DOSBox, but it was less useful for some of the more involved debugging that I wanted to do. So it's not as flexible, but it's also a helpful tool. And then there's also, in addition, in terms of resources for analyzing these programs, there's a really good YouTube channel of someone, their name is Dan OOCTL1, so I think it's Dan out of control, but unclear. But they have a really great MS-DOS malware playlist, so they play a lot of these samples. So that's kind of cool just to watch them. All right, so we finally have all of our background covered, and we can look at these samples now. So the first one I'm going to be talking about is crash. So crash is, I think it's a nice one to start out with. It has this infinite loop of a pretty animation, writes to the VGA buffer with peek and poke, and it renders the computer unusable, so you have to reboot it. It's less destructive compared to other viruses that used similar VGA buffer manipulation techniques, but it's very pretty. So I'm going to play that now, but I do have a mild flashing lights warning, so I'll give a countdown before I play the video, and then I'll just tell everyone when it's over. So I'm going to play the video in 3, 2, 1. So it's fun. Okay, so up next we have Cuckoo. Cuckoo is in a similar vein of being very graphical, but also a bit devious. So it searches the file system for exe files and com files, and then it overwrites them with the payload. And the payload, essentially, when it executes, it just displays this obscene collection of boxes that say cuckoo over and over, renders the command prompt unusable. You have to reboot the machine. And then I have a fun, depending on how you define fun, fact here. Cuckoo, one definition in Russian, means peekaboo. So when it's going through, it's searching the file system, and every time it finds a target file that it can infect, it displays a message of peekaboo, I found you, which is savage. So here's a quick video of it. Just, you know, I admire it. Okay, our next one is Verdem. Verdem is pretty basic. There's a lot of text here, but the important things to note are that it's a demo virus that was written by Ralph Burker. So the author, same virus that I had a screenshot of earlier. And he wrote a book that I did buy off Amazon called Computer Viruses and Data Protection Unclassified, where he goes through the techniques and the details of his virus implementation. So the important ones to note of this long list are it's a file infector, it infects com files, it doesn't try to target command.com based on how the root directory is structured, and when it infects a program, it adds an additional functionality, which is a bizarre guessing game, and the difficulty level of the guessing game for numbers is dependent on the virus generation. So it goes up to 9 generations, and presumably gets more difficult after each generation. So this is what it looks like when it's executed. So you have this nice little display of your programs are struck by Verdem, generation 1. It's not as cool, but it's a nice demo. All right, so now we're getting into the more fun ones. So this is Stoned. Stoned is a pretty famous bootkit. It inspired a range of related bootkits in the same virus family. Those other bootkits had varying levels of sophistication. So I say here Michelangelo, what an absolute flop, and I stand by that. Because Michelangelo essentially just copy-pasted Stoned, added a tiny logic bomb that triggered on Michelangelo's birthday, and then didn't do anything cool graphically. So, like, what a wasted opportunity. But Stoned, the origin of Michelangelo, was able to infect boot sectors of multiple different formats of storage media. So it had routines both for infecting floppies and for hard drives. And then it also had some nice stealth routines and techniques. So it saved the original MBR in a, I say here, hidden area of the disk. It wasn't hidden, but it was a known section, or it was a known group of sectors that would be free because of where the MBR was stored based on how fdisk worked. So it saved the MBR in one of those sectors, And then it also had a TSR functionality where it would spoof valid interrupt 13 reads and writes to the disk that was infected. And of course, it had the lovely logic bomb, which displayed, you can see it on the right there, the famous "your PC is now stoned" message. And the logic bomb part of that was that it was only displayed 1 out of every 8 times, which was determined based on the PC timer, so interrupt 1C. Okay. All right. So the next one is tequila. So tequila combines a lot of the different techniques that I've talked about. So it has a graphical component, it has a bootkit component, it has some TSR functionality, and it has some fun stealth, and then also a multi-part payload. So it has this nice fractal animation, which is a Mandelbrot, but it's also savage because it infects the MBR partition table, it installs some handlers to run as a TSR, and then the most interesting thing I think about this one is that at the top, you can see there's this line, execute move AX FE03 and 21 key to go on. So what is that? Well, it's a multi-part payload that requires user interaction. So if you run this in debug mode and you enter those instructions and you run it, it'll reveal, welcome to T Tequila's latest production. Contact T Tequila. Loving thoughts to Linda. Beer and tequila forever. Way to go, Linda. Like, legend. Okay. And now we're coming up on our greatest hits, Marine, which is probably one of my favorites. So Marine is, in my classification of MS-DOS malware, I describe things as level 10 savage, and this is level 10 savage. So it has a few different payloads. They each trigger based on the conditions of different logic bombs, but the most brutal one triggers in June, and it shreds the MBR, which is not a very technical term, meaning it encrypts the drive. And then there's at the bottom here, when it's doing that specific payload, when that payload is triggered and it's executing, it has this fun boat animation, and at the bottom, Vsie Namore is, in Russian it means essentially everyone to the ocean or everyone on the sea, but the vibe is basically like, let's go to the beach. So we have Nicki Minaj, TSR icon. And this is what it's doing when it's executing. So in terms of graphical components that employ stealth, if a user is presented with this and it's running on their machine, they're probably not going to think it's that bad, right? Like, it's just a boat animation. Maybe they don't understand the words at the bottom, but it's fine. Everything's fine. Nothing bad is happening to the drive right now. We just have our boat on the ocean. But in reality, here's the call graph of the function that's encrypting the drive. This is a screenshot from Cutter. And this also, important to note, this isn't the global call graph, so this is just the call graph for this function. And again, the virus has several different payloads. So depending on if you're in June or you're executing it when it's in June, you might have a different payload that has a similarly very complex function call graph. And so each of these show the complexity and the sophistication of these viruses. In addition to that, Marine is, again, like I said, one of my favorites because every part of it is kind of just showing off the skills of the VX writers. So rather than doing things the most straightforward way or the most common way, even in terms of techniques used by VX writers of this time. It's not using common interrupts like int 21 that frequently. It's doing direct manipulation of relevant functions via the I/O ports, and that includes both for the graphics routines and for the more nefarious routines. So there's stealth, there's, I guess, what you could consider a form of code obfuscation because they're just using very complex tricks in their assembly, and respect it. It's cool. What's the boat? Okay, so. Okay. So now we're coming back to our original question of why study an end-of-life OS? Well, I think it's pretty well summed up here by David Byrne and the Talking Heads in their music video Once in a Lifetime, which is malware, same as it ever was. So just a few connections that I want to highlight. There are a lot of foundational techniques of the malware masters of the 80s and 90s that inform malware of the present day. So we have legacy BIOS interrupts that were featured prominently in malware, especially malware like bootkits, up through later versions of Windows, especially through Windows 7 before the switch to UEFI. One relevant case study is NotPetya. So again, there's the occurrence of the int13 BIOS interrupt for disk services. Okay, yeah. And while the switch to UEFI firmware, or the UEFI firmware boot process from the legacy boot process, which included the legacy BIOS interrupts, really changed the landscape for bootkits, particularly Windows bootkits. Modern bootkits still use techniques that were developed by the earliest bootkit writers in the BSI heyday. One interesting example actually is that the first PC virus, it's called PC virus, because there were viruses that infected machines prior to this, but it was Brain in 1986, which was also a bootkit, and then when it was activated, it had a message about the virus authors. But the techniques used by Brain back in 1986 did things like saving the original MBR, doing spoofing of int 13 for reads and writes, and some of those techniques of saving an original MBR or saving an original piece of memory that you want to alter are still obviously used by bootkits of today and malware of today. And then a few other techniques. So in the same way that the IVT was a data structure that was leveraged for persistent storage of malicious code in DOS-era viruses, the IDT was also leveraged in the later Windows threat landscape. So I say here different names for the same thing, which isn't a robust antivirus strategy. It's a death cab for QD track, but reusing the IVT in its new iteration for similar malicious activity is a really interesting way to see the lineage of these viruses and their techniques. And one prominent example, very specifically in terms of using the IDT, was Rovnix, which is a bootkit from 2011 that stored its payload in the IDT above interrupt 80, in a range of entries above interrupt 80, which was known to be typically free. And similarly, the IVT above those ranges was free and was used to store payloads in earlier 80s and 90s bootkits or 80s and 90s viruses. So still in 2011, it's manipulating the same data structures and leveraging them to pretty powerful effect. And then also studying MS-DOS malware can make you inspired to rewrite an old classic and show that a modern OS can still be vulnerable to boot process exploits because of its backwards compatibility with the legacy BIOS boot process. And going back to Stoned, the stoned bootkit was rewritten and presented at Black Hat 2012 to show how that legacy BIOS boot process was still a really important and vulnerable target. So while the IVT got upgraded to the IDT, it remained a useful data structure. And you could hook system calls on later versions of Windows via the IDT in similar ways that you could do it with the IVT. And the IDT and the SSDT, so System Service Descriptor Table, were both used to this effect. So you could hook the SSDT and the IDT in similar ways that you could hook the IVT in earlier viruses. So, and then finally, I just said, looking into the past can give you ideas for where to search for inspiration next. So I think a lot of the techniques that were developed in this era were very sophisticated, very interesting, and can be a nice place to look at if you're feeling bored or stuck with something that you're working on in exploit dev or malware analysis or any area of security, really. So loud. Okay, so where to now? I have a repo on GitHub with sample COM programs, learning resources, a guide for setting up a 16-bit reversing lab, so you can check that out. I also have some deep dive blog posts on my website, so exploring similar or exploring specific subtopics, so TSRs in a lot more depth, as well as early bootkits. I've also written an R2 plugin, like I mentioned, for reversing 16-bit binaries. So if you are interested in using that, feel free to contact me on the socials or talk to me after. And then finally, I have a playlist for when you're reversing 16-bit malware. So, and I believe that's it. Cool.
For Nika, please. We have roughly 8 minutes for questions. Questions from the audience? Don't be shy. One right there.
You mentioned one of your reasons for studying this is that it is still relevant today. How completely relevant is it to modern day viruses?
Yeah, I think, let's see. I mean, other than the connections that I highlighted in some of the earlier versions of Windows, I think some of the, especially the bootkit techniques, are seeing a resurgence. I mean, especially there was the Black Lotus UEFI bootkit this year, and I think for like a number of years, a lot of people in that space were considering the bootkit era effectively over. A lot of virus writers were switching to firmware implants and not going after bootkit functionality specifically. But there we are. So I think that's a very strong one in terms of just seeing the lineage of bootkits from then until now. I think a lot of the stealth and persistence techniques, it's not a one-to-one, but I think there's sort of a simpler or more condensed version that exists in earlier virus samples of the 80s and 90s that grew and developed and can be seen in malware today.
Thank you.
earlier you had a slide that said something like reading the source code for some things. Did you ever, you mentioned one that I sound like a professor made it or someone at a university. Did you ever like find historical samples of the source code for these things, or did the old authors just put them on GitHub in modern times or something?
So I think it's a good question. I mean, in for some of them, they published their samples or they submitted the assembly files or what have you to zines, and a lot of those zines are archived. So in terms of looking through, I mentioned like the 29A and the 40 hex zine archives. Samples that weren't in the VX Underground GitHub repo. There's a few that just haven't been migrated over that are still in those zine archives. But some of the viruses that were written during that time were written by professionals in the field as essentially POCs, and then were adopted and modified, similar to how techniques can be leveraged today. But the source code for Verdem was not in Ralph Berger's book, but he talks about it extensively, and then that was on the GitHub repo for VX Underground. So there's like plenty of ways to find them.
Over the course of throughout like the 80s and 90s, were there changes to like how viruses would propagate or replicate in addition to like the techniques that people used? And, you know, if so, was it mostly like over storage media, or did it go over networks as well?
Okay, let's see. In terms of different ways for replicating and propagating, I did mention at the beginning, but I didn't get into it very much. A lot of them use polymorphism in some capacity. So those like polymorphic techniques were pretty instrumental in a lot of these samples, especially of that era. And then what was the second part? Like spreading over networks?
Yeah, like how would they spread?
I mean, a lot of them, for spreading techniques, a lot of them were basically transferred using physical storage media. So a lot of the ways that they were transferred was sometimes like sharing floppy disks, but also they propagated over BBSs. They propagated, I mean, there was I didn't mention it. The first virus was Creeper, which was actually a worm, and it infected PDP-10s. And so that was in late 70s, I believe, maybe 1981. But that was technically the first virus, but it was not a virus, it was a worm. So it infected networks. And the fun fact about Creeper is that it caused the first antivirus solution to be created. So Creeper had its counterpoint in Reaper, and Reaper's job was just to go in and disinfect all the machines in the network that were infected with Creeper. So cute little pairing.
You're welcome. Any more questions? Going once. You have one?
There was a comment at the beginning. It was like some sort of elk hunter or something. You said you would tell us more.
Oh, yeah, okay. Elk cloner. So elk cloner was a virus. It was written by, I believe, their name was Richard Skrenta in, I want to say 1984. It was written 2 years before the release of the first Macintosh, so it targeted Apple IIs, but it had, the way that it ensured persistence, like memory residence, was it infected RAM, but when it triggered, when the payload was triggered, it had this silly poem that was displayed. I'm gonna try and remember it. It was like, elk cloner, it'll like get on all your disks, it'll infect RAM to send in the cloner, blah, blah, blah. So it showed this funny little poem, but your machine was toast, so.
Anyone? Questions? Awesome. Then let's give it up for Nika once again, please.
Thank you.
Thank you for being a presenter of BSidesSF 2023. Here's a token of our appreciation. Thank you to a sponsor, Sec. And thank you everyone for joining us this year. We really appreciate it. We'll catch you in the next year.